It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Jessie Norman, Labour MP Rosie Duffield, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, or CLASS, which is a left-leaning think tank, and Catherine Birbalsingh, the Government's Social Mobility Commissioner and Head Teacher at Britain's strictest school. Today, competing visions between the Tories and Labour on second jobs.
Of course, your primary time, the vast majority of your time, should be spent looking after the interests of your constituents.
When you have a conflict of interest between your private interest and the public interest, you must always resolve that in the interests of the public, not of yourself.
Boris Johnson is set to be grilled all day long across Westminster about sleaze. First up, he'll face Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll have it live at noon. Also, our guest Rosie Duffield will tell us why she felt unable to attend the Labour Party's annual conference because of her views on trans women. And increasing costs of second-hand cars, energy bills and transport are all contributing to soaring UK prices. Let's start with the story and reports on inflation. Show you the headline in the Financial Times. UK inflation rises to highest level since 2011. Bigger than expected jump to 4.2% in October adds rate rise pressure to Bank of England. They didn't, in fact, increase interest rates when they had their latest decision. But as the headline says, they will have to perhaps consider it again. How worried are you as a former Treasury Minister?
Well, I think there's definitely a degree of concern. The bank has been talking about inflation rising, but always hitherto as a temporary matter. And I don't know if I'm alone, but I think there's a sense now that this may be more long-lasting than they'd originally thought. And I think that's definitely a cause for concern. They've got a duty to maintain at 2%, and we're well over that.
Rosie, how worried are you?
I think people have had so much hitting their purses, and the fact that, we're paying more and more for the cost of living on a daily basis and wages are hardly soaring at the same time. It's really worrying, yeah.
Catherine?
I worry about our families. Families are doing the right thing and going out and working hard and taking responsibility. Then what else are they meant to do? And if the cost of living is getting higher and higher, then that's something the government needs to do something about.
Yeah, what do you suggest when you say the government need to do something about it? Is there anything you have in mind?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I kind of feel like we could go back in time, maybe. I slightly worry. I don't know. I'm not an economist, so I don't know. But when the government spends and spends and spends like that, I get very worried. OK. Ellie Mae?
I think we need to be clear that there's been a set of choices that have been made by the government that have made life harder for people. This is not something that's just happened inevitably. It's not like the rain changing. These are a series of choices. So, for example, recently the government decided to withdraw £20 a week from the UK's poorest families. So when you look at inflation figures like this, you know that those families are going to have to choose this winter between heating and eating, a choice that they wouldn't have to make if the government had behaved differently. So there's nothing inevitable about this. This is about a series of choices made by the government, and the result is that people will really suffer this winter.
Jessie?
Well, I'm afraid there's a lot that's not true about that. What's driving the rise in inflation is the doubling and more of the gas price recently, what's happened to oil and gas prices. It's also been a factor of the change where everyone has gone back to work coming out of the furlough scheme, and that has driven labour costs higher. So there's a whole series of things. I don't think anyone's suggesting we shouldn't have put the furlough scheme in place. It's been a lifesaver for millions of people who might have been out of work.
Well, Ellie, do you accept there are global issues at play here, not just government issues?
I think one thing that we've learned in the last 18 months is that the government has immense power to shape society however it wants. I mean, we created a society last year where people weren't allowed to leave the house en masse. So the government has enormous power, and I don't think that it should try and get out of that. And on energy specifically, we work at CLASS with GMB Union, which is the gas union, and they have been warning about something like this for a very long time. They've been talking about the need to implement an energy strategy to avoid exactly this kind of thing happening, and they've been ignored. So fundamentally, it is an issue of choices, and we need to be clear about that, because that means that governments can make different choices for the benefit of the people of this country.
I mean, I asked Catherine, Jessie, what she would think in her mind about how to reduce rising prices and inflation. Do you think the Bank of England should now use the lever at its disposal?
Well, I don't think it's really for politicians, and certainly not for recently, as it were, departed Treasury ministers to be commenting on Bank of England policy. It is their job to manage the rate of inflation, and they have tools in the armoury which include a rise in interest rates. Now, no one wants a rise in interest rates at all, and therefore, if they do genuinely, as they reflect on it, think this is a short-term matter, they may decide not to raise them. It was noticeable they didn't raise them last time round, and that raised some eyebrows, certainly in other parts of the economy. But it is up to them. We'll have to see whether they want to use that very big and potentially quite dangerous club.
Right. When it comes to things like heating bills, are your constituents, are these the sorts of things that constituents are talking to you about? But what would they like you to do about it?
Well, I mean, Ellie's right. These are political decisions. Of course they are. And it's always the poorest that pay the price. The poorest that are, you know, even in my constituency, people just about managing. Furlough helped enormously if you're running your own business, for example. But the cost of everything is going up. So if you're running a restaurant, and there are lots of those kind of hospitality businesses in my patch, everything you're paying for is so much more expensive. So the furlough scheme has come and gone, and they're still paying out. So yes, rising cost of heating and the rising cost of a pint of milk are all going to hit people really hard, and it's really disappointing.
Let's move on and talk about the issue of second jobs. It has, to some extent, engulfed Westminster. Let's have a look at the Guardian story and headline. It says Boris Johnson proposes ban on MPs working as paid consultants. Now, that argument about MPs' second jobs, what kind of outside work they should be allowed to do, if any, has erupted in the wake of the lobbying scandal involving former Conservative MP Owen Paterson. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Adam, there are now competing visions of reform here to the system and how to regulate second jobs for MPs. Just tell us what Labour were suggesting and what the government is now proposing.
Sure. Well, Joe, what's happening today is there are two different motions being debated in Parliament, but they could both lead to, in the short term, to the same place, which would be a process where the Commons comes up with new rules to govern what MPs can do as their second job. The Labour proposal on the order paper today is that you'd have a ban on MPs doing what they call political consultancy or advisory jobs. Exactly what that is, TBC. The government have put forward their own motion which takes that idea and then adds to it the element that you would also have some way of taking into account how many hours MPs were spending on their outside jobs and whether that was appropriate or not. The government using that to say they're actually going even further than Labour are proposing, to which Labour say, but in the long term, we've clamped down much harder on second jobs overall, only allowing MPs to do jobs that had some kind of public-spirited element to them or were necessary for people who had particular qualifications, who had to practice to keep them up. But, yeah, bit of an arms race between the two parties about who is clamping down harder on this.
Right, so what happens from here?
So whatever happens, whichever motion gets through, and it will probably be the government one, that would then mean that the role is handed to the Standards Committee in the Commons. The little twist here is, though, that the House of Commons Standards Committee is already looking at drawing up a new code of conduct for MPs. They've been doing that work for about the last year, and it does include some stuff about outside earnings. And this morning, Chris Bryant, the Labour MP who chairs that committee, was saying he could have a draft of his new code of conduct published as soon as the end of this month. So that would then take this process into a whole new gear, and we'd actually see some potential new rules in black and white.
Right, it's going to be a very busy afternoon to start with. Adam Fleming, thank you very much. Rosie, can you perhaps tell Jessie what you don't like about the government's proposals on this?
I think, for a start, I can't imagine having the time to do another job, personally. I mean, it's
no other job at all?
No,
not being a doctor like your colleague Labour MP Rosanna Allen-Carr.
That make the time to carry on practising as A&E doctors, and thank goodness they do. You know, we had quite a few nurses in the last Parliament, for example, and there was a flu crisis. They were needed. They needed to go back to work. That is really admirable. But I know how hard it is for colleagues like Rosanna to try and juggle all the things she's got to do. The idea that you could sort of sit around and advise other governments in your spare time that we don't have is really shocking. And it's all about greed, actually, isn't it? We don't need that kind of money. We have a very good salary, and I can't imagine doing it personally, but that's what we don't like. We don't like people doing things where they're going to be influencing a policy potentially, something they're being paid for. It's extraordinary. No wonder the public are really fed up and have had enough of politicians.
Right. Perhaps you'd like to defend the government's proposals or say why you don't think what Labour is suggesting is better.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, in a way, I'm the wrong person to comment on this because I've never had a consulting or business relationship with an
But
MP,
many of your colleagues do.
Of course, that's true on all sides of the House.
Yeah.
But I do think that I think it's a little hard to say there isn't enough time, but you make your own time if you're a doctor. I'm sure if Keir Starmer had accepted money for, as I think he has done for advising as a lawyer, he thought he was making time to do that. And so there does seem to be some scope. And there are people who come into politics having had family businesses and other commitments that I think they would want to honour and that the House might want them to honour. This is a parliamentary process and we need to let it take its course. But I would say that the government's position, I think, which is no lobbying Parliament through these contracting arrangements.
Well, there were rules about lobbying, of course, to start with. So we're talking about sort of consultancy that involves any knowledge or advice on Parliament, how it works. Moving
the bar, as it were, further in that direction. I think that's frankly thoroughly sensible. And I also think there's the idea that it shouldn't be your preponderant, your priority should always, and I'm sure Rosie and I and every, constituency-oriented MP in the country would think that your first priority, whatever else you do, should always be your constituents.
All right, well, we'll come back to the time in a moment. Ellie, where are you? Should MPs have second jobs at all?
I think that there should be a blanket ban on second jobs with very, very limited exceptions, because I think that MPs who have second jobs have so far managed to get around the existing rules, and I think that they would probably find ways of getting around new rules unless there was a sort of blanket ban. And the Yorkshire Post listed the 16 MPs who make the most out of second jobs, and only a handful of those were doing things like being a solicitor, and one of those solicitors was Geoffrey Cox, so that's a whole other thing.
But is that then about the amount of money you earn or the amount of time that you spend on it?
It's about neither. It's about a conflict of interest. If you're getting paid large sums of money to be a consultant for a mining company or an oil company or an investment bank, those are the most popular jobs in terms of making the most money, the sort of second jobs, then who are you representing? Are you representing the people who voted for you to be their representative in Parliament, or are you representing the needs and interests of a private company? And I think what we have seen, in the case of Geoffrey Cox, for example, is that he seems to be representing the needs of the people who are feathering his nest rather than his constituents, and that is the problem.
That is a problem, isn't it?
I think it clearly is, and I would actually go further than Ellie. I think it really does matter not only that there be no conflicts, but that the preponderance of your time should not be spent on work that's not parliamentary.
All right, we'll come back to how much time. Catherine, yes, I can see you want to come in, of course. You have a couple of jobs, don't you, at the moment? Is that possible, do you think, for MPs?
So, it's interesting because it is something to consider. So I do the social mobility chair a few days a month, and the money that's paid for that comes to the school. And the reason I want it to come to the school is that I feel it would be somewhat unfair to take that money from me, because I'm obviously taking something away from what I give to the school by doing this extra job. So that's sort of my personal position. Having said that, I do understand that if we banned out all jobs completely, second jobs, then we might not get as many talented MPs because they might want to just do other things. So I realise there is that tension. But that's my own position. And the thing is, it's not just about having other interests and defending companies. It's just about the time that you give. But I have to say, I'm very much looking forward to these reforms because it means that several MPs will be coming to work at my school.
A vested interest there. I mean, listening to that, isn't it the case that MPs who have other qualifications, other experience, bring that to Parliament, whether you are a solicitor, a lawyer, a doctor, or even giving advice on things like the environment, for example?
Yeah, obviously, all of that is really important. And there's lots of colleagues, including Chris Bryant, who write amazing books, for example. But I would imagine he does that in his spare time. And there is this conflict of interest issue that Ellie raised. That's the most important thing. But what I find really shameful, actually, is that we're having to kind of go through Parliament and get the Standards Commissioner to tell us to be better and to behave better. And I think if I was watching this and deciding who to vote for, I would really factor that in. Why do we need to be told that this is not not actually good enough. We should be thinking that ourselves. It's a moral issue, isn't it?
Well, why can't they?
Goodness knows. We've got 650 MPs and they represent society, and like most of society, I'd say a very large proportion of them are very hard-working, engaged, pro-social people, and there are a few people who reach different decisions. And, and some of those decisions actually, so to be fair, some of those decisions are sensible, proper ones, and need some investigation and understanding, and some of them plainly are not and need to be rethought.
All right, well, let's look at some of the specifics then. What counts as a paid consultancy, Jessie? I mean, we had your colleague Laura Farris on our programme just the other day talking about advising companies on tech regulation or environmental waste disposal. Would that be unacceptable?
Well, this is the reason why we need the Standards Committee to go through this in detail, because in this broad brush language of today's motions, you're going to need to find how you draw the line. I personally think that if you're using inside information about Parliament to guide external lobbying organisations, or if you're turning around and lobbying even under the guise of consulting your colleagues, then you're probably crossing a line. But that's something that the Standards Committee is going to have to work out.
All right. I mean, Labour wants a more general ban on second jobs, with some exceptions. Is being an author or making media appearances, paid media appearances, a second job?
I don't know, I'd love to have the time to do those things.
I know, but in your mind, do you think they should be stopped?
Because
your colleagues
that's
do
an
it.
interesting one. Yeah, loads of people do that. But it isn't a conflict of interest like advising companies on things that might happen in law, is it? So I guess that's a personal choice.
Right, except Labour wants a more general ban on second jobs.
Yeah, and we've got colleagues, like I said, who write books, who get paid for television,
so
who do radio shows.
Should they stop doing it?
I guess we'll have to debate that in Parliament. I don't know how I feel about that, if I'm honest.
Right.
I do know that I don't think people should be lobbying on behalf of companies or advising companies on the law. I think that's a no-brainer, but this one is a bit more of a woolly area because I know lots of colleagues that do that. So.
But you can see then how difficult it is for MPs to self-regulate in that sense.
And we shouldn't be doing that, should we?
Right, the common sense test is being used. Jessie mentioned it earlier in terms of the amount of time that should be spent. How much time should be spent on your job as an MP as opposed to any outside work?
Well, look, I mean, I think for most MPs, I'm sure I speak for Rosie, certainly for myself, it's an extremely occupying preoccupation. I mean, if you said to me, I can't remember the last month in which I worked less than a 70-hour week, let alone a 40-hour week. So the idea that somehow we're going to capture people by these employment rules actually is just a mistake. But I think what we mean is that, and what I think this motion means is that, it should be your principal predominant focus. There shouldn't be scope where people can spend a lot of time doing other things that aren't really actually devoted to the interests either of proper, effective parliamentary activity or the interests of their constituents.
Ellie?
All of this stuff about, is it okay for people to write books? Is it okay for people to turn up in the media? How many hours a week? To me, it's just all a distraction from the reality of the situation, which is that of the most well-paid MPs, the vast majority of them are consulting, and I know I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating, for oil companies, for mining companies, for banks.
Sorry, when you say the vast majority of what or who?
Of the MPs that make the most out of having second jobs, they make the most from consulting for these private companies. And I should also mention...
But is that worse than other MPs who spend most of their time doing their outside work, even if there isn't a conflict of interest, but they can't concentrate on their work as an MP?
Well, of course it is. Of course it's worse to have a conflict of interest than not have one, absolutely.
No, but in terms of earning vast amounts of money, as you say it, for their outside work.
I mean, I don't think that MPs should be able to have second jobs except for very limited exceptions. That's what I think the blanket rule should be. So.
All right, well, let's have a look at this headline in The Times, because there is a problem within your party, Jessie, over this, because there are many Tory MPs who are very unhappy about these rules coming in. Tory MPs set to revolt over ban on second jobs. I mean, how much anger and frustration is there on this?
I don't know. I haven't talked to colleagues particularly about this, and I'm slightly sceptical about that headline, to be frank. Let's see what the voting is like this afternoon. But I think, let's just think about it. If we're talking about 30 MPs of whichever party, we're talking about less than 5% of MPs. Right. So the question is, what does Parliament as a whole think would be an appropriate balance to strike? And also, slightly more abstrusely, is Parliament itself going to regulate itself, or is it going to, and how far is it going to, as it were, farm that out? And there's been a question about the Commissioner for Standards, and that's also going to be an important part of the argument, whether the Commissioner is adequately empowered and adequately protected and supported in the relationship that she or he, in due course, has to the Standards Committee.
Right. I mean, I think we can show you some pictures of the MPs invited to a reception. These are MPs from the 2019 intake, Conservative MPs. Do you think there is an increasing divide between these new MPs, many of them from former Labour constituencies, who have a different view on this to some of the more established Conservative MPs, many of whom do have outside jobs, rightly or wrongly?
Well, there's always a conflict between the more recent joiners who are learning their trade, really embedding themselves with their constituents, and some of the older people in the House. And so there may well be that. And there may be a specific conflict in this case over some of these concerns, particularly if those areas are, as it were, reflect different political opinions in their constituents. We want constituency MPs to be focused on their constituents, so in a way we should expect that.
I think a lot of the new intake had, you know, quite small majorities. They were surprise MPs. They've had to work very, very hard to kind of understand their job. They were thrust into it. They don't have the leeway. They're not in some sort of massively historic safe seat, are they? So they do have to work. They have to keep on their toes. They can't afford to just sit back and have a holiday in the Cayman Islands whilst they're advising that government, for example. You know, that's a kind of luxury that someone like me in a marginal seat would never have, even if I thought it was morally correct, which I don't.
Right. I mean, Catherine, looking at this from the outside, how do you view it? Do you think people do think that MPs, many of them, are on the, you know, make, if you like?
Yeah, I imagine some do. I'm always slightly surprised. I don't understand why you'd want to give your, you know, public service is something I feel you kind of have a calling for, and you want to kind of give and do something right for society and live a life that's worth living. And if you're, you know, being a bit corrupt, then it just seems odd to me. But shouldn't we distinguish between people who become MPs and you're already a doctor and you want to continue practicing a little bit, and people who get a second job when they're already an MP and they get it because they are an MP, and that company thinks, ha, I'm going to get in with this MP and we're going to use him and then we'll be able to get questions asked for us and so on. Isn't there a distinction between those two? Because we don't want to stop the talent from coming into politics. But then on the other hand, there is something that doesn't sit well with me, with the idea that just because you're an MP, you can go out there and get certain jobs as a consultant. Yeah, that doesn't sit well with me.
Well, and I think that is certainly what the parties are looking at. Well, with our talent here in the studio. Rosie, let's talk to you because we haven't heard from you since you announced that you wouldn't be attending the Labour Party conference. You said you were made to feel unwelcome and unsafe because of your views on trans women. What exactly did you mean?
OK, for a start, I didn't announce that at all. I mentioned it to a couple of friends that was the reason I wasn't going, because there was a lot of hostility and I thought it would distract from Keir's first big speech. The fact that someone leaked it to the Mail on Sunday and it then became a massive, huge story did distract from all kinds of things at conference. So that was a real shame, because that's literally the opposite of what I wanted. But it's not really my views on transgender women, which, you know, it's my views on women's rights and self-ID. I have absolutely...
Self-identification and self-declaration.
Absolutely no problem whatsoever with trans people at all, never have had. And, you know, I've been misquoted all over the place. I think everyone has the right to live exactly how they choose to, but me and plenty of other women and hundreds of my constituents have concerns about self-identification and how we're going to manage that with single-sex spaces.
Right, so this is, you say, I simply want to use the word women. Yeah. Hopefully that was the correct quote in the Times. Women defined by their biological sex. Absolutely. As opposed to their preferred gender identity.
People who menstruate, for example. You know, women do, mostly. Some people who have transitioned may feel differently, but that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that 51% of the population have to change their language.
Right. Do you understand why transgender people and groups who feel excluded from that definition have become upset about it?
To a certain degree, but women and women's safe spaces are my main concern. And trans groups have plenty of representation, rightly so, and they do talk about these things, but I don't want the rights of women to be in conflict with the rights of trans people.
I mean, Ellie, these are views expressed by Rosie that are held by many in society, and yet they seem to be unacceptable to express, certainly in some forum. Why?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the majority of women actually do support transgender rights, and they do say that, you know, a trans woman is a woman. So actually, it may be held by some in society, but it's not the majority view, and it's not the majority view of women. So I think that's the first thing to say.
But what about the definition of woman as by your biological sex rather than your preferred gender identity?
You know, I actually don't know why some people are women and why some people are men. No one on this panel does. And anyone who claims to know the answer to that question is a liar. All I care about is the principle of live and let live and showing one another respect. So if a person says, yes, I was born a man, but I am a woman, and this is how I live my life, I want to respect that person for who they are, because I don't think they're doing anything wrong, and they're certainly not bothering me in any way. So I think the ultimate important principle here that we should all share if we want a free and accepting society is live and let live.
And is that...
That's absolutely great, and I totally agree with that in principle. But if you are a woman who has been abused all of your life and ended up in prison, you may not feel quite that liberal towards someone in a male body who is then allowed onto your wing of the prison. You may have had a lifetime of abuse and rape, which has been done to you by a man in a male body, and when they're just calling themselves a woman, you may feel very differently about being in a hospital ward with them or a prison wing. And I think that those women, it's usually working class women who haven't necessarily had the best start in life or the best experience that are really worried about this, and the ones that are having to deal with it rather than politicians. And my job is to protect those women that don't have a voice in Parliament like I do.
Do you accept that?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to say again that the majority of women actually agree with me on this issue.
Well,
so I think that's the first.
Fine, but no, I do. But I want you to respond directly to
on lots and lots of polling, lots of national polling that asks a range of questions about.
You're talking about self-ID particularly?
No, I'm talking about the broad principles of supporting people's rights to change gender, which they're legally allowed to do.
So do I.
So let me finish my point. So I think, you know, we've seen in other issues like abortion, for example, where people who are opposed often use the most extreme cases to argue against, in principle, what are positions that we can all agree with, which is people should be respected for who they are. And actually, when we're saying that a small group of people should not be allowed to live as they are because other people might be upset about it, well, that is the very essence of discrimination. And I don't think that most of your viewers watching this would support that.
Rosie?
I fundamentally disagree that we should impose male-bodied people in single-sex spaces. And if that's called discrimination, I think that's really unfortunate. I think we need a conversation about that.
Because I think, I'm really glad you said that, because I think you've hit on exactly what the problem is there. So instead of saying, first of all, there are transgender men that don't seem to be part of this conversation. But what you've said there is male-bodied people. And I want the viewers at home to really think about why it might be upsetting for a transgender woman who has suffered a lot. I have a few friends who are transgender women and who have had periods of their lives where they've not been able to leave the house because they're abused on the street, and where the process of changing gender has been quite distressing and difficult. And to go through all of that and to have somebody in public life who's a representative of the public and has a big public platform and a lot of responsibility, to call them male-bodied people, I think what is being communicated there is I don't accept and respect you for who you are. I am not interested in your journey.
All right. Well, let's get Rosie. Rosie, is that what you mean? And does Rosie have rights that she is also trying to protect here?
I think 51% of the population are physically female and have the right to at least debate or talk about whether people in a male body are allowed into single-sex spaces without any debate or discussion.
Right, Catherine, where are you on this debate? Because it has, at times, been a very hostile and difficult debate to articulate.
Yeah, and that's the thing that concerns me most, is the hostility and the threats. I myself have suffered from threats. I've had death threats, but threats of violence and so on. And why? Because I decided to set up a school to help children in the inner city and come out of their disadvantaged situations. I mean, there was a time where I would be worried walking down the street, going home, about whether someone would attack me. And Joe Cox happened at that same time. It's absolutely terrifying. And, you know, my advice to anyone in that kind of situation is, I suppose you need to stay strong, but there are so many people, I can't tell you the number of teachers who write to me regularly on Twitter, DMing me and so on, saying, thank God you're saying something. Thank God you're speaking out, because I cannot speak out because I'm worried about losing my job. I'm worried about the attacks. I'm worried about losing my friends. I'm worried about my safety. And that it's really sad that we are in that environment now in society where people are scared to be able to simply disagree politely. And that's something that I don't know. I don't think it used to be the case. And perhaps it's social media and modern times where we've all just lost a bit of our dignity and lost the ability to simply disagree politely.
Right. Is that because it goes to the very core of who people are and who they want to be, Catherine?
I don't know. No, I think it's because we've lost our manners. We've lost a sense of dignity in society about how to behave towards each other. And social media, I think, it has a huge part to play in this, because it's sort of like road rage. People just attack and they don't know who they're attacking. And we lose our humanity a bit when we do it through social media. And while, you know, I'm not completely against technology, obviously there's lots of good things that come with it. Yeah. I do think we should be very wary of it.
Right. I mean, let's bring it back to the political arena, because it was your party, Jessie, that launched the consultation on the Gender Recognition Act, which is why it has become such a big talking point in political circles. Now, the intention was to make it easier for transgender people to change their legal gender on birth certificates. The government, in the end, decided against it. Has it let trans people down?
No, I don't think so at all. I think, actually, that there is a balance, a common sense balance to be struck here, which is that people want to support and recognise the concerns and the feelings and the sense of identity of trans people, men and women. But they also want to protect all of the achievements of feminism over the last 30 years in creating a safer and more equal place for women. And if the world isn't safer now and more equal as a result, that is a serious problem. And as Rosie says, it affects 51% of the population. It affects all of our mothers and wives and daughters, and we should be deeply concerned with it. So I think there's a common sense position that allows both of those things to sit alongside each other. And I would absolutely share the concern that Catherine has raised about the sheer levels of nastiness and aggression associated with often articulating very common sense positions.
Right. Do you agree there has been an awful lot of hostility around this, mainly on social media, but also beyond?
Well, of course there has. It's a very uncivilised conversation that we're having. And the reason it's uncivilised is because the premise of one side is you don't get to say who you are. I get to decide who you are. And then so trans people hear that. And then they're being asked, why won't you respond in a civilised way? But you can't have a civilised conversation where both sides are not fundamentally respected for who they are as people. And that is what is happening. And I just want to say one more thing, actually, because I really want to make sure I get this in, which is it's very frustrating for me as a woman to be told over and over again that my rights are in jeopardy because I believe in the right of trans people to live and let live. If this really was a problem, there would be an explosion of incidences because trans people have always existed. They have always used the spaces that they want to use. And there are I don't know a single incident where a woman has been put in danger because of a trans person. And I challenge the viewers who are watching this to think about whether they have ever been threatened by a trans person.
Right, well, then
whether they've ever heard of that happening. And I think what you'll find is that doesn't happen. And instead, what does happen is men threaten women. Men are the problem. It's male violence that are the problem. It's not trans people. And actually, trans people suffer from male violence as well. So we have more to win by joining together as women with
but Ellie, that comes back to the political proposals of self-identification, which have not now gone ahead. But the Labour Party is still very much promising that if they were to win the next election. Is that right?
The Labour Party want to make it easier for people to self-identify rather than sort of all these years of hardship and things.
So are you at odds with your own party?
No, not necessarily. I agree with that. But whilst also keeping those single-sex spaces for people who are biologically male not to be invited into women's refuges and things like that. There's a whole separate... And Ellie's absolutely right about trans women. Trans women are just as likely to be attacked by males as biological women.
Right.
And trans women are biological women if they identify and change over. But we've got this woolly area that we haven't been able to debate because it's so toxic.
Right. Have you spoken to Keir Starmer about
Yes.
it? Because, right, you have since the conference.
No, not since the conference.
Right, so you haven't spoken since you didn't...
2 days before the conference.
Right, since you didn't go to the conference, and you know that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, told the Andrew Marr programme that saying something that you retweeted or said you liked, only women have a cervix, was something that shouldn't be said and wasn't right. How did that make you feel that the leader of your party said something you believe in, rightly or wrongly, shouldn't be said and wasn't right?
I was disappointed about the tone of the entire debate during that week, and lots of Labour MPs were really put on the spot. And again, that's because we haven't had those conversations. We haven't had the chance to debate it or talk about the nuance in these arguments. We're just put on the spot and asked these questions. And you can't necessarily know if we've missed out the kind of critical thinking that's involved in such a huge change in society.
But you're happy to remain in the Labour Party for now?
Yes.
Right. We're going to move on because Catherine Birbalsingh, as we have said, and so has she, has recently been appointed as the new chair of the Social Mobility Commission. It's the body that advises the government on social mobility. This is how The Guardian covered the story last month. The headline, which I'm sure you've seen, Catherine, UK's strictest head teacher. Catherine Birbalsingh made social mobility chief, opponent of woke culture, who founded outstanding London Free School, takes government appointment. Congratulations, first of all. What is your core mission?
Well, to improve social mobility for the kinds of families that we have here at school. And, you know, I think that involves lots of work on early years and what happens within families and what they can do, because there's so much that families can do that they don't realise. Things like new technology, like smartphones. You give a toddler a smartphone, it's going to make it much more difficult for them to learn how to read. A book is black and white and flat. A smartphone has all sorts of colours and explosions and so on. You don't want to ruin your child's chances of being able to be a good reader. And then there's just all the stuff that takes place at school, which obviously I'm a real expert at, and what makes for good teaching and what makes for a good school. I mean, it's funny, people call me the strictest. In fact, if you Google the strictest teacher in the world, my name comes up, believe it or not. I know.
That is some accolade.
Well, all strict means is you're clear and you're consistent. That's what it means. You love them enough to hold your standards high. And then on the other side, I'd love to look at routes into the workplace, apprenticeships. I think lots can be done there.
All right.
Really, you know, it's quite easy if you're going into university, but if you want to take other routes into the workplace, it's much more difficult.
All right. The Equalities Minister, Liz Truss, said that she wanted you in the job because you'll expect high standards. Everyone would agree with high standards, and you won't indulge in the soft bigotry of low expectations. What does that mean? Or what do you take it to mean?
So the thing is, for instance, what can happen in schools is that child comes from a disadvantaged family. The teacher wants to be kind and compassionate. And so when the child doesn't do their homework now and again, they let them off because they think, well, they're from a disadvantaged family, it's difficult for them, so I'm not going to hold them to account. But the problem is, if over time you allow your standards to drop for that child, in the end, when the child is leaving school, and nearly 20% of children can leave school that are functionally illiterate or functionally innumerate, that is where the crunch comes, because they're not able to do much with their lives. And then they're having to start again. If you're not able to read, it's really, really hard.
Okay.
And so it's school to hold you to account earlier on in life, to let you fail then because we love them. And it's what I said about strict. People think that it's being mean. It's not.
All right.
It's holding your standards high so that the children will meet those standards.
Ellie, what do you make of what you've heard? The bigotry, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Is that a problem in our schools? Should background not be as central as perhaps some people think?
I think that children's life chances, if you like, are determined by factors outside of school. So we know that social class is a bigger determinant than any other about what a child's life chances is. And, you know, this past couple of years, teachers have had the opportunity to see inside their pupils' homes because of Zoom lessons. And what they've often seen in the background is poverty. They've seen damp and they've seen deprivation. And I think when you're living in that kind of environment, you know, you can often be living in overcrowded accommodation. Maybe you haven't been able to eat because your parents can't afford food, or you're living in a cold house.
And should exceptions then be made, or should they be treated differently because of those sorts of conditions that they're trying to learn in?
Personally, I would like to see that, but I think we actually need to tackle the root cause, which is the circumstances that children grow up in. And that needs a whole suite of government policies to actually make life better for Britain's poorest families, rather than expecting teachers to try and compensate for a really serious situation at home that I just don't think that teachers have the capability to do because it's such a big job.
Jessie?
Well, everything that Ellie May says may be true, but that's not to the point, because the point is what Catherine Birbalsingh is being asked to do as a teacher and as a head, and to think about all the different kinds of policies, whatever the background may be, that will allow a child to succeed. And when you have 20% emerging functionally illiterate and innumerate, that is a catastrophic loss of talent. And one of the things, I don't know whether Catherine will know this better than me, but I think I'm right in saying that one of the things that can be done that is one of the most heavily differentiating things for supporting a child is just to read to them if you have some time, either at school or at home. And taking a library book from the school and then bringing it home and reading with the child. That makes, more, I think I'm right in saying, more difference than almost any other single intervention. That's not an expensive intervention. That's something that any parent could, in principle, do or organise themselves or teach
But did the government make a mistake when it didn't take on the recommendations of Sir Kevin Collins, the government's Education Recovery Commissioner for England, after the main part of the pandemic, because they didn't take on his recommendation to spend the sorts of cash that he said would be necessary for disadvantaged children to catch up?
Well, they didn't commit to it at that time. What they committed to was a process in the spending review.
It's a fraction of it.
Well, let's see where that works out, and let's see how it pans out in terms of the relation to the specific groups that we're talking about. One of the things that will be interesting will be to ask Catherine whether she thinks money is going to be a central part of the recommendations that she makes.
Catherine?
Well, look, money is always great, but what is important is to note just how much can be achieved with little money. When I say, for instance, you need money to have a campaign on phones and to let parents understand the damage that they're doing to their little toddlers by giving them phones. But that then also helps people to help themselves. We are all about here not giving the man a fish, but teaching them how to fish. And look, there are some schools that do an amazing job, and there are some schools that do a less amazing job. We need to look at the differences and make it so that all schools can do an incredible job.
All right.
There are some families who are really poor who do manage to do the sorts of things that we say is impossible. The idea that poverty makes it so that you simply can never achieve in life, it's not true. I've spent over 20 years working with disadvantaged families, and I can tell you that many of them are doing the right kinds of things. What we need to do is make sure that that advice is widespread, and that everyone knows what they need to do.
All right, Catherine, I'm just going to put something that you tweeted about original sin. You caused some controversy when you talked about children being born with original sin and needing to be taught to be good. It says on your tweet, if we can show it, it was a response actually to someone else. Children need to be taught right from wrong and then habituated into choosing good over evil. That requires love and constant correction from all the adults in their lives over years. Moral formation is a good thing. Do you agree, Rosie?
I don't personally agree with that, but having been a teaching assistant in early years and having been to children's homes, because it isn't just via Zoom, when you're having a 4-year-old coming into your school, you go to their home, you meet their family, you see the circumstances that they're living in before they join the school. You do actually, if you've got a heart and if you're a mother and if you teach tiny children, you do compensate for some of the things that you know are difficult in their lives, I'm afraid. And one thing that the last Labour government did, which was a huge step towards social mobility, was Sure Start centres. I went to them, I took my children, and then I ran a group for single mothers like myself, got people into education, gave them the idea that they're not worthless, that they can achieve. We're talking about BTECs, we're talking about other ways into education other than just university. And I think those kind of things are all part of this. You know, what's your expectation? What should you feel that you can achieve? Just because you're, you know, not born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you should expect to be able to be nurtured through your school career and helped towards, you know, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Catherine, she's a teacher with vast experience, but I think a certain degree of kindness and compensation has to come towards children who are really disadvantaged.
Do you agree with that, Catherine?
know that is not kind. It is not kind not to teach them. It is not kind to support them through. It doesn't mean that you say you throw them to the wolves. It means you scaffold them and ensure that they can meet the same standards. If you lower your standards for those children end up in society not being able to have the same chances at the same jobs and the same opportunities as those who are richer than them. And it is our duty as adults in their lives and the schools, it is our duty to make sure that we scaffold them well enough so that they can get there.
All right.
To lower our expectations of them is to let them down. I feel so strongly about this. And it is not compassionate to do that. It is hard to hold the line. How could you possibly disagree with the idea of teaching children right from wrong? All original sin means is that we are flawed. Man is flawed. So it's much easier to eat a chocolate brownie than it is to get on the treadmill. It's the same for me. It's the same for all of you.
All right. Well, let me. Yeah, go on. Let me let Rosie respond because we're almost at time.
Ultimately, it sounds like we had the same goal to improve people's life chances.
Sure, but there is. But it's important. It's important in
there.
Catherine's new role as chair of the Social Mobility Commission. If those are the views that she's espousing,
but presumably she's not going to be running that by herself. She's going to be taking other views and thinking about things. And I think her point of view is very clearly that she wants people to do better. And as a teaching assistant, I want people to do better. But you also have to factor in how hard things are, like reading with your children, if you've got all these other pressures.
Right. I think we're almost at time with Prime Minister's questions. Just very briefly, Catherine, Alan Milburn, former Labour cabinet minister, had the job and resigned because he said, "Oh, we haven't got time." I'm so sorry. Thank you to all of our guests. Prime Minister's questions.
In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the considerable public concern in relation to the impression that significant political donations can help acquire a peerage. The Honourable Member for Nahigan Nia will publish a bill later today which will prohibit large party donors from being nominated to the other place for a period of 5 years. Will he offer full government support to my honourable friend's efforts?
Mr Speaker, I will study his proposals with care when the parties opposite commit to stop taking funds from the unions in order to control their policies.
Mr Speaker, during a recent visit to Barnet Hospital, I was told that A&E there is routinely seeing twice the number of people for which it was designed. Thanks to the hard work of staff and big funding increases, the NHS is seeing more patients and delivering more tests, treatments and operation than at any time in its history. But what is the government doing to urgently assist the NHS to tackle spiralling demand for healthcare and a tough winter ahead?
I thank my right honourable friend because over for what she does to represent her hospital, and I thank them, the NHS staff, for their amazing work that they're doing. We're supporting them by recruiting, as she knows, 50,000 more nurses, putting another £4.5 billion into the NHS over the rest of this financial year. And the best thing we can do to protect our NHS over this winter is everybody to come forward and get their booster vaccination.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Trust matters. And after the last fortnight, the Prime Minister's got a lot of work to do. A central plank in this government's promise to the north of England is a Crossrail of the North, with at least an entirely new high-speed rail line between Manchester and Leeds. A Crossrail for the north, an entirely new line. That is the promise. It's already been made. So I don't want the Prime Minister fobbing off the House about waiting till tomorrow. He can say today, will he stick by that promise, yes or no?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
He should wait and see what is going to be announced tomorrow, because we will produce a fantastic integrated rail plan. I'm not going to spoil it for them, Mr Speaker. Why would I? We're going to produce a fantastic...
Order. I expect the front bench to behave better than what it is doing at the moment. If you don't want to listen to the answer, let me know now. I do, and I cannot hear when you all shout together. We want better politics. I expect better politics from both sides. Let's show a little bit more decorum than we're seeing at the moment. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when we produce our integrated rail plan tomorrow, people across the House and across the country will see what we are doing to cut journey times, to make life easier and better for people in the North East, in the North West, in the Midlands, across the whole of the north of the country. Mr. Speaker, with the biggest programme of investment in rail for a century, Mr. Speaker, for a century. And what we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is we are giving people in those communities the same access to commuter-type services that people in the southeast of this country have felt entitled to for more than a century. And that is going to be levelling up across the whole of the UK, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that was a lot of words. But it wasn't a yes. So that's one important promise to the North that he won't stand by. Let's look at another. In February this year, the Prime Minister told this House, "I can certainly confirm that we are going to develop the eastern leg as well as the whole of HS2, the whole of HS2, a new high-speed line running continuously, no gaps, between Birmingham and Leeds." So will the Prime Minister confirm that he stands by that promise?
Prime Minister.
I'm afraid the right honourable gentleman is in danger of getting hoist on his own petard, Mr. Speaker. He needs to wait and see what we announce tomorrow, because I think he will find that the people of the North East, of the North West, the people of Leeds, the people of Nottingham, the people of Sheffield, and the people of the whole of the North West and the North East of this country will benefit massively from what we are going to announce.
Keir Starmer.
Again, Mr. Speaker, a lot of words, but not a yes. So that's two important promises to the North that he won't stand by. No wonder trust in the Prime Minister is at an all-time low. Across the country and belatedly across this House, there is now agreement that Owen Paterson broke the rules and that the government should not have tried to let him off the hook. Many members opposite have apologised. The Business Secretary has apologised for his part. The Leader of the House has apologised for his part. But they were following the Prime Minister's lead. So will he do the decent thing and just say sorry for trying to give the green light to corruption?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, as I've said before, it certainly was a mistake to conflate the case of an individual member, no matter how sad, with the point of principle at stake, and we do need a cross-party approach on an appeals process. We also need, Mr. Speaker, a cross-party approach on the way forward, and that's why we've tabled the proposals that we have to take forward the report of the Independent Committee for Standards in Public Life of 2018 with those two key principles that everybody in this House should focus primarily and above all on their job here in this House, and secondly, that no one should exploit their position in order to advance the commercial interests of anybody else. That's our position, Mr. Speaker. We want to take forward those reforms. In the meantime, perhaps he could clear up from his proposals, whether he would continue to be able to take money as he did from Mishcon de Rea and other legal firms.
Order. Prime Minister. As you know, and I do remind you, it's Prime Minister's questions, not Leader of the Opposition's questions. Keir Starmer.
That's not an apology. Everybody else has apologised for him, but he won't apologise for himself. A coward, not a leader. Weeks defending corruption. Yesterday, a screeching last-minute U-turn to avoid defeat on Labour's plan to ban MPs from dodgy second contracts. But waving one white flag won't be enough to restore trust. And there are plenty of opposition days to come. And we will not let the Prime Minister water down the proposals or pretend that it's job done. We still haven't shut the door on the revolving door where ministers are regulating a company 1 minute and working for them the next. There are plenty of cases that still stain this House. There are two simple steps to sorting it out: proper independence and powers for the Business Appointments Committee and banning these job swaps. Will the Prime Minister take those steps?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've called, as you know, and indeed you have called, Mr. Speaker, for a cross-party approach to this. And what I think we need, what I think we need to do is to work together on the basis of the independent report by the Committee of Standards in Public Life to take things forward and indeed to address the appeals process. But what I think everybody can see, Mr. Speaker, is that in a classic lawyerly way, the right honourable gentleman is now trying to prosecute others for exactly the course of action that he took himself. And what I think the nation wants to know, because his register is incomplete, who paid Mishcon de Rea and who paid the 25,000? Who's paying him for his...
Just a minute. Prime Minister, I don't want to fall out about it. I've made it very clear. It is Prime Minister's questions. It's not for the opposition to answer your question. Whether we like it or not, those are the rules of the game that we're all into, and we play by the rules, don't we? And we respect this House, so let's respect the House. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, that newfound commitment to upholding standards didn't last long. Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. When somebody in my party misbehaves, I kick them out. When somebody...
Order. Mr. Clark.
Where's Rob
Mr. Front. And I don't think... Look, this is not good. We lost a dear friend. I want to show that this House has learnt from it. I don't want each other to be shouted down. I want questions to be respected. I expect the public to actually be able to hear the questions and the answers, because I'm struggling in this chair. I need no more. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, when somebody in my party misbehaves, I kick them out. When somebody in his party misbehaves, he tries to get them off the hook. I lead, he covers up. Let's try another issue. We know that Owen Paterson was a paid lobbyist for Randox. We know that he sat in on a call between Randox and the minister responsible for handling health contracts. We know that Randox has been awarded government contracts worth almost £600 million without competition or tender. Against that backdrop, the public are concerned that taxpayers' money may have been influenced by paid lobbying. There's only one way to get to the bottom of this: a full, transparent investigation. If he votes for Labour's motion this afternoon, that investigation can start. Will he vote for it, or will he vote for another cover-up?
Prime Minister!
I'm very happy to publish all the details of the Randox contracts, which have been investigated by the National Audit Office already. We're talking of cover-ups. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we still have not heard why the Honourable Gentleman will not tell...
Order. Prime Minister, sit down. Prime Minister, I'm not going to be challenged. You may be the Prime Minister of this country, but in this House, I'm in charge, and we're going to carry on. End of that. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister just said he's happy to publish all the Randox papers in relation to these contracts, so we'll take that and we'll pursue it. And I remind the Prime Minister, when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I prosecuted MPs who broke the rules. He has been investigated by every organisation he's ever been elected to. That's the difference. Billions of pounds of taxpayers' money handed to their mates and donors. Tory MPs getting rich by working as lobbyists, one not even bothering to turn up because he's in the Caribbean advising tax havens. And the Prime Minister somehow expects us to believe that he's the man to clean up Westminster. He led his troops through the sewers to cover up corruption, and he can't even say sorry. The truth is that beneath the bluster, he still thinks it's one rule for him and another for his mates. At the same time as his government are engulfed in sleaze, they're rowing back on the promises they made to the North. And it's working people who are paying the price. Is it any wonder that people are beginning to think that the joke isn't funny anymore?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it is plain from listening to the right honourable gentleman that he seeks to criticise this government while refusing to explain his own position. And you've ruled on that, Mr. Speaker. You've ruled on that, Mr. Speaker, and I hear you. But his own misconduct, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely clear to everybody. His own misconduct is absolutely clear. And meantime, Mr. Speaker, we will get on a cross-party basis. We will get on a cross-party basis with taking forward the business that I've outlined, and we will get on with the business of this government, which is leading the country out of the pandemic.
Order. Prime Minister, just, I'm struggling to hear, and if it's correct what I've said, it was about Leader of the Opposition and misconduct. We can't or cannot accuse somebody of misconduct. Now, I may, and just before the Leader of the House gives me an answer, all I'm trying to say, I cannot hear. If it was said, I want it withdrawn. If it wasn't, I will accept it. I'm just a moment. Prime Minister, I can't.
Mr. High Speaker, I referred to the right honourable gentleman's misconduct, because that is what he is guilty of. That is what he is guilty of.
Order. I don't think this has done this House any good today. I'll be quite honest. I think it's been ill-tempered. I think it shows the public that this House has not learned from the other week. I need this House to gain respect, but it starts by individuals showing respect to each other. Right, let's go to Lee, no less. We're going to James Grundy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Lee have never accepted our forced merger with the friendly rivals, but rival town of Wigan back in 1973. Could the Prime Minister tell me how we could escape the big government of Big Wigan by getting our own council back?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I thank him for his campaign against local Labour government over-taxing and delivering inadequate services. The local boundary commission will look at the boundary reviews, but meantime I will support him in any way that I can.
We now go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it used to always be said that the Tory MPs were behind the Prime Minister, but my goodness, look at the gaps on the third, fourth and fifth benches. Mr. Speaker, the rebellion has clearly started. Mr. Speaker, this Tory sleaze scandal has now been hitting the headline for the past 14 days. And yet, it's pretty obvious that the Prime Minister spent less than 10 minutes coming up with yesterday's half-hearted, half-baked and already half-botched proposals. These so-called reforms don't even scratch the surface. This sleaze scandal runs far, far deeper. Month after month, the public have witnessed scandal after scandal. Peerages handed to millionaire donors. VIP lanes gifted COVID contracts to Tory pals. Dodgy donations for luxury holidays and home renovations. The Prime Minister and his government have been up to their necks in sleaze. Can the Prime Minister tell us exactly which one of these scandals his proposals would have stopped?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the humble crofter, as he refers to himself, for his question, and I would just say that what I think we can do is pursue a cross-party approach based on the report of the Independent Committee on Standards in Public Life, which has much of a profit in it. And it says, amongst other things, that it's important that this House should be augmented with outside experience of the world. It's important that members of this House should have experience of the private sector, as he does. And I think on a cross-party basis, we should proceed with the couple of reforms that I've indicated.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this is about Tory sleaze and Tory corruption. And the Prime Minister has basically admitted that not one of this government's sleaze scandals would have been stopped by his so-called plan. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, considering The Prime Minister has been at the rotten core of all these scandals. The trail of sleaze and scandal all leads back to the funding of the Conservative Party. Since 2010, Mr. Speaker, the Tory Party has made nine of its former treasurers members of the House of Lords. Every single one of them has something in common. They have handed over £3 million to the Prime Minister's party. That is the very definition of corruption. It is the public's definition of corruption. Will this government finally accept that this is corruption, or is the Prime Minister the only person in the country who is the brass neck to argue that it was all one big coincidence?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I won't comment on the missing £600,000 from the SNP's party accounts. But I do say, Mr. Speaker, in all sincerity and heeding what you've said earlier on, I think these constant attacks on the UK's levels of corruption and sleaze do a massive disservice to billions of people around the world who genuinely suffer from governments that are corrupt, who genuinely have no ability to scrutinise their MPs, Mr. Speaker. This is one of the cleanest democracies in the world, and people should be proud of it.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister join me in celebrating the 50th anniversary this year of the formation of the 177-mile path for walkers along Offord Dyke, which runs through Clwyd South, and give his support to the recently launched Offord Dyke Rescue Fund to repair and preserve this monument and nature reserve for future generations?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've had the good fortune to walk Offord Dyke very recently, and I'm delighted that English and Welsh organisations are working together to protect that fantastic national monument, and Historic England has committed to give almost £300,000 more to that great cause.
Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, ambulance response times are now the worst ever. People are waiting for ambulances longer than ever. And with A&Es in crisis, patients are stuck in ambulances outside hospital longer than ever. Waiting times aren't statistics, they are people. People often in great pain and in danger. So why is this government closing ambulance stations in parts of our country? Why is the West Midlands Ambulance Service closing up to 10 community ambulance stations in Rugby, Oswestry and Craven Arms? With this health crisis for our ambulance services and in our A&Es, injured, sick and elderly people are being hit. When will the Prime Minister deal with this health crisis?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that ambulance crews and ambulance services are doing an amazing job, particularly at this time of year, and I thank them for what they're doing. We are supporting them with more cash. Another £450 million was awarded to 120 trusts to upgrade their facilities. And as he knows, we're putting another £36 billion into dealing with the backlogs, which is fundamentally affecting the NHS so badly at the moment, through the levy that we've instituted, which I don't think he supported.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Domestic heating accounts for 30% of UK carbon emissions, and I support the government's incentive scheme to replace the old gas boilers with environmentally friendly alternatives. But now we're building more homes than we have for many, many years. Can we build upon the success of COP26 and ask really what is the progress that is being made on the standards for new build homes to make sure that our new homes are fit for the future?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. He's totally right to focus on the issue of future-proofing homes and making them low carbon. And by 2025, our future homes standard will ensure that new homes produce at least 75% fewer CO2 emissions.
Fairness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I visited a GP practice in my constituency of Sheffield, Brightside and Hillsborough and was horrified to hear about the amounts of abuse staff are currently experiencing. Their workloads are under extreme pressure and this is not helped by the Prime Minister making demands about appointments whilst he has still failed on his manifesto pledge to recruit 6,000 more GPs. So, will the Prime Minister apologise for this broken promise to GPs and their staff who are on the front line working under ever-increasing pressure and depleted staffing resources?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, I want to thank GPs for everything that they're doing, particularly during the booster rollout. But what we're also doing is not just recruiting as many GPs as we can, but we have 10,000 more nurses this year than last year, 25,000 more healthcare professionals altogether. There are more people, Mr. Speaker, now working in the NHS than at any time in its history. And because of our investment, the extra 36 billion that we're putting in, there will be even more. And I'm afraid that the lady opposite voted against that investment.
David Druid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Following on from COP26, can my right honourable friend confirm that maximising carbon capture and storage capacity across the whole United Kingdom is a priority for this government? And, I mean, despite the doom and gloom and the words of rejection and snubbing from the SNP members opposite, can he also confirm that the Acorn carbon capture and storage and hydrogen project in my constituency of Banff and Buchan has a key role to play in this country's future carbon capture and storage capacity targets to meet net zero?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's quite right to champion carbon capture and storage, which has a great future in Scotland, in spite of all the gloom stirring of the party opposite. The Scottish cluster remains on the reserve, and we will continue to study it, and we hope to bring it forward in due time.
Murray Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The River Tyne, with its world-renowned offshore and subsea sectors, has been repeatedly sidelined by this government, despite me and others constantly lobbying ministers for investment that would massively increase employment opportunities and help the UK's transition to net zero. However, Mr. Speaker, I'm very excited to see our voice is now being magnified by a new Tyne task force set up by the local authorities, the port, businesses and the combined authority. So will the Prime Minister, here and now, commit his government to work with us to realise the full potential of our great river?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question, and she's absolutely right that the River Tyne is a massive economic asset for the whole of the North East. It has suffered from historic contamination, but we're going to work with the North East Local Enterprise Partnership to invest another £6 million to help develop clear plans for sustainable economic growth along the whole of the estuary.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crawley constituency was one of the most negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, but thanks to significant support from this government, we are seeing recovery, unemployment now beginning to come down, and we look to a confident future. In that vein, will my right honourable friend please look favourably on Crawley's Platinum Jubilee city status bid?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I wasn't aware until today that Crawley was bidding to become a city, but I will look at it. I will look at it very carefully, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure there is an excellent case in there somewhere.
David Linden.
Thank you. Speaker, every year 100,000 babies are born premature or sick in the UK and admitted to neonatal intensive care units. The Prime Minister will be aware that today is World Prematurity Day. Now, there's cross-party agreement in this House to bring forward neonatal leave and pay. So rather than wait for a complex, controversial employment bill, will the Prime Minister bring alongside a standalone bill to legislate for this so that next World Prematurity Day the 100,000 babies and their parents don't have to choose between spending time in the hospital or unpaid leave from work?
I thank the honourable gentleman. I know he's a passionate campaigner in this area, and one way or another, and I'll get back to him on the exact way, Mr. Speaker, we will legislate to allow parents of children in neonatal care to take extended leave, giving them more time during the most vulnerable and stressful days of their lives.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further education colleges like Hotwood Hall in my Hayward and Middleton constituency will play an essential part in building back better. The team at Hotwood have supported over 8,000 learners on courses as diverse as small business management and animal management, as well as 6 new T-level courses. So, can I invite my right honourable friend to come and visit the inspirational team and the students at Hotwood Hall, and as a special treat, come and see Middleton's very own flamboyants and flamingos and our endangered potoroos?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his kind invitation. I will certainly keep it in mind, and the government is absolutely committed to reforming technical education through new T-levels, and that's why we're investing a further £65 million to develop teacher retention and support and recruitment for teachers in FE. As for the potoroos in his area, I will bear that. Are they wild, Mrs. Speaker? I will do my utmost to come and inspect them.
Rebecca Longbelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Laura told me that Remembrance Sunday hurts. It hurts because there have been no medals for her granddad's service and the thousands of men involved in nuclear weapons tests overseas between 1952 and 1991. It hurts because studies of such veterans have shown increased miscarriages, increased birth defects, and the same rate of genetic damage as clean-up workers at Chernobyl. And it hurts because the UK is the only nuclear power on Earth who has denied recognition. So I ask the Prime Minister, will he recognise nuclear testing veterans today and agree to meet them? The Leader of the Opposition has.
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful for bringing this to my attention, and I will certainly make sure that we get a proper meeting with representatives of the nuclear veterans that she raises.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was in Greece with Save the Children, I learnt that change at any border was quickly communicated down the line. If migrants and asylum seekers knew that they would be directly returned to France or taken to a third country pending application, if they knew this, would they risk a dangerous and illegal crossing and make their way to France in the first place? Can I ask my right honourable friend what further measures are being considered? Because this is an issue of great concern in Eastbourne, along the coast, along the country, and I'm anxious to be able to reassure my constituents that there are plans ahead.
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and she has much relevant experience in her work for Save the Children in Greece. Our only credible way of fixing this, Mr. Speaker, is with our new plan for immigration, and that will be made possible with our new Nationality and Borders Bill, which will make it possible for us to distinguish at last between those who come here legally and those who come here illegally, Mr. Speaker. And I hope very much that it will command the support of the whole House.
Kuenssberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In May, part of Northwich Station in my constituency collapsed. I've asked the Transport Secretary to intervene and build back better and fairer to allow access for people with disabilities. He's declined my kind offer. I'll ask the Prime Minister to intervene. No bluster, substance, build back better and fairer, Northwich Station, it's in the north of England. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm tempted to invite the honourable member to wait and see what we do for rail funding tomorrow, but I will certainly look at what he has to say about Northwich Station with keen interest.
Sarah Atherton.
Over 4,200 servicewomen and veterans use the democratic process to contribute to the Defence Select Committee's inquiry into women in the armed forces. A formal response is still awaited from the MOD. Now, whilst the majority of women enjoy a fulfilling career in the military, shocking issues were raised around sexual assault, bullying and harassment. I know the Prime Minister agrees with me that our armed forces are the best in the world. Would he also agree with me that we need to make sure the British Army is the best place to serve as a woman?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and she's campaigning on a very, very important issue. I think too often we find that our armed forces fail to provide the wonderful women in our armed forces with the support that they deserve, and that's why I'm pleased that my honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has secured a parliamentary inquiry into this for the first time, and it's vital that we support and encourage women in our armed forces who make a massive difference to those services.
Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has cost businesses in Northern Ireland the £850 million to date to operate the failed and suffocating protocol. Lord Frost is today in Belfast. When will the Prime Minister fix this by legitimately activating Article 16?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and I think the word I would fasten on in his question is legitimately. And there is no question that the use of Article 16, which after all has been done by the EU Commission to stop vaccines being exported to this country, is something that is perfectly legal and within the bounds of the protocol.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited Humphrey Perkins School in beautiful Barrow-upon-Soar. The students asked me there, what is the government doing to engage children and students from all backgrounds to encourage them to aspire to become an MP and even the Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
I think what I would say to my honourable friend and her students is that nothing that is said or that takes place in this House, none of the argy-bargy, the repartee, the occasional abuse to which we subject each other, Mr. Speaker, should in any way deter anybody from seeking a career in politics, but it is a wonderful privilege, and we are all, Mr. Speaker, very lucky to be here.
Sting Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Edinburgh West, we are now finding numerous people coming to us with delays from DWP in pensions and benefits, to add to the delays that others are facing over passports and DVLA. Can the Prime Minister tell us, please, amongst the many jobs being done at the moment, who is making sure that the departments of government are running smoothly and quickly?
Prime Minister.
I thank her, and I think actually that the Department for Work and Pensions under my right honourable friend the Secretary of State has been a government that has performed outstanding service, performed miracles, and amongst the things that it has achieved, Mr. Speaker, is to help to get millions of people effectively back into employment in spite of all the difficulties that we have faced. We now have unemployment running at virtually record lows in spite of all the difficulties we faced in this pandemic as we come out of furlough, and that is largely thanks to the work of the DWP. Of course, there is more that can be done, and that people can always up their game, Mr. Speaker, but I think that the DWP, the officials working in the DWP across the country, huge numbers of men and women, have done an outstanding job.
Final question, Jake Murray.
Mr. Speaker, in July 2019, I was in Manchester when the Prime Minister committed to build a new line, Northern Powerhouse Rail, between Manchester and Leeds. It was a commitment reaffirmed in our manifesto in November 2019 and last month reaffirmed in the Prime Minister's conference speech in Manchester. Were the voters of the North right to take the Prime Minister at his word?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and they should wait and see what is unveiled tomorrow, where, Mr. Speaker, he may learn something to his advantage.
A point of order, Michael Fabric.
And that brings us to the end of an extremely lively and at times rowdy Prime Minister's Questions. Time to introduce our guests for this part of the programme. Paul Scully, Business Minister for the Government, Louise Haigh, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, and the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Let's start with that. I mean, the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, was jumping up and down in his chair during the exchange, the clash between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, telling the Prime Minister to sit down, to stop asking the Labour leader Keir Starmer questions when it came to outside earnings. There was a slight sense of the House getting very excited about talking about itself, of course.
How unusual. I mean, Westminster enjoys nothing more than a row about things that directly concern themselves rather than concern our viewers in a direct way. Yeah, but the context is, though, you know, we're at the end now of 2 weeks of discussions, headlines, revelations, arguments over this business of what MPs do when they're not on the green benches and when they're not doing things for their constituents. Boris Johnson today tried to use a very familiar tactic that he does all the time. Instead of answering questions, he then asks a question of Keir Starmer. And in this case, he was trying to push him to tell the public exactly who he was working for when he did some work for a law firm when he was already MP, but before he was the party leader. But Lindsay Hoyle, I think, has actually got to the end of his tether with all of this. And it's very, very unusual. Let's just say we heard the Speaker of the House of Commons say, you may be the Prime Minister of this country, but I am in charge in this chamber. Sit down, Prime Minister. Now, that is not something that happens every day, let alone every week. And it really shows you, actually, I think, how much tension there's been in Westminster about this. In the Commons, and how much MPs on all sides actually think that this is a problem for all of them, even if the sort of direct issue affects probably a few dozen MPs, and the direct sort of political problem is that Downing Street has made a real mess of this in the last couple of weeks.
Well, I've just been told that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has retracted the comment calling the Prime Minister a coward, not a leader. Again, unparliamentary language. There was also a moment, wasn't there, when Boris Johnson, again posing a question, accused Keir Starmer of misconduct, referring to the law firm Mishcon de Reya. And in the midst of all that, I think the Speaker was unable to exactly hear what was going on. He didn't actually retract what the Speaker thought was misconduct being levelled at Keir Starmer.
I mean, all this sort of messiness, though, does tell us one thing, is that both of the party leaders are aware that right now this is somewhere where they either need to hold their line on the government side or think that they've got a political bruise that they can keep up on punching at the Labour side. And actually, our assiduous viewers will probably remember it's many, many months, actually, since Labour has been trying to create this case that somehow the Tories are in hock to cronies, somehow they're all involved in sleaze. They've been trying to make that case for a long time. The government would, of course, always deny that. But it's only really in the last couple of weeks that it's really been starting to sort of hit the top of the agenda, really also started to wind up Conservative MPs. And that's why, and we'll see this later in the Commons today, there's no sign and no chance right now also that Labour is going to give up trying to prosecute this case.
No, they want to keep the story going to some extent. Paul, before we get into some of the detail about what might or might not be banned in terms of second jobs and outside earnings, it is astonishing, isn't it, that what started as an attempt by the government to circle the wagons around Owen Paterson, and we heard the Prime Minister say it was a mistake to conflate that case with the system. It's ended up now with the Prime Minister pushing for wholesale reform of what MPs do.
Yeah, I'm glad he said it was a mistake. It was a mistake. I think there is, though, a sense we're absolutely still behind the fact that there needs to be an appeals process within that those investigations. There is actually two investigative procedures within the Commons. There's a grievance procedure which has an appeals system. This one doesn't. But to conflate it was absolutely was a mistake.
And calling now for wholesale reform.
Well, I think actually the reform that he's calling for comes from the standards report back in 2018, a cross-party standards report. So. Laura's absolutely right. We shouldn't be talking about ourselves. We should be tackling the issue.
But as you say, they only really raised it because of the case of Owen Paterson. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone there, would he?
Well, it's brought it to the fore. Yeah. It's clearly been in the media. It's been covered. So actually, it's an issue that does need to be tackled. It resonates. We need to tackle it.
Minister, can I just pick you up on something before we get any further into this? The government's consistently saying, there should be an appeals process. The way it's set up right now actually is basically an appeals process. An independent person looks at the facts, comes to a view. Those findings are then put to a cross-party panel, which also has independent lay members. And that essentially does function as the appeals process. And the MPs had every chance to put their case all the way. So isn't that really misleading if we're going to say it's a time for change? You ought to be honest about that?
I just think it needs looking at again, because I think there's always a sense that the Standards Committee, looking at it with the lay people and the party members, will always look at the independent and say, well, it has been heard by an independent person.
That would have exonerated him.
Well, no, I'm not.
Owen was profoundly guilty.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he absolutely had a case to answer. I mean, I don't want to go back and rehearse it, but he had a case to answer. This is not about, certainly from my point of view, it's not about overturning Owen Paterson's situation
but
at all.
But you voted 2 weeks ago to do that.
Because it is about the appeals process. But the mistake was conflating the two. I think that's really important.
All right.
So we now need to get this done and tackled for the benefit.
OK, well, let's talk about what is going to actually be done. Does the government want to ban all outside consultancy work?
It's going back to the 2018 cross-party report, which talks about consultancy and anything that's basically looking in on politics rather than Parliament, rather than necessarily.
But what does that mean if people are listening to you? Because parliamentary consultancy jobs, I mean, that's a fairly narrow definition, isn't it? I mean, it wouldn't actually cover that many MPs.
I think actually, well, look, what it does, it starts to eliminate jobs that are that MPs take up by dint of them being an MP in the first place. There's lots of people that are lawyers, that are in business, that are in public service, that are serving MPs because they were already doing that role, or they've got another skill alongside their parliamentary role. But for example, if someone approached me, before I was a minister or after I'm a minister, and said, "Will you come and help us talk about Parliament, talk about how you influence government, not necessarily lobby, because that's already against the rules," then the proposal is that is inappropriate, because I'd only be given that because I'm an MP.
All right, conflict of interest to some extent as well has obviously been at the core of this. What is a reasonable limit on the amount of time spent on a second job if you're an MP?
Well, I think, to be fair, this is the stuff that we've got to work through, because it's not, I can't...
Well, this is the suggestion that Boris Johnson has made. It's about time limiting what you do outside your role as an MP.
And I think that's the sort of detail that needs to be worked through. As I say, it was raised in 2018. We do need to work through and build a cross-party consensus that actually works out that level of detail, what is considered reasonable time, etc.
Right. I mean, Keir Starmer yesterday claimed victory in terms of pushing, as he says, the government into doing precisely what Labour say they want to do, which is restrict outside work. You want a more general ban on second jobs, and that would include the very thing that Keir Starmer did as an MP, earning £100,000 or so for legal work that he did.
Well, I don't know about pushing. I think that Boris Johnson's been dragged kicking and screaming to the Commons today to put forward their amendment, which doesn't go as far as ours does, because ours would be binding. It would ban MPs from taking all paid consultancies and directorships when the Committee on Standards brings forward those recommendations to the House. But yes, we do want to go further now. We do want to ban all second jobs with some very limited public service exemptions. For
Including
example,
the one that Keir Starmer would
yes,
be doing
yes, and Keir Starmer gave up his practising certificate over 2 years ago, best part of 2 years ago now, so he can no longer, and he does no longer provide that kind of legal advice. But we're clear that, with very, very limited exemptions, for example, my colleague Rosanna Allen-Khan, who has been serving in A&E during the pandemic, with those very limited exemptions, constituents expect their MPs to be doing the job of an MP full-time and serving their interests.
Right, full-time. So when it comes to instances of being a doctor or a nurse or perhaps even a lawyer or working for a charity, what are you talking about in terms of the majority or all their time on a full-time basis for an MP? Arguably, you could say the government's calling for more stringent restrictions in terms of the amount of time people will be able to spend on any second job.
Well, personally, I don't see how anybody's got any time to be doing anything else on top of their job. My second job is Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which I do on top of being the MP for Sheffield Heeley. I don't, other than extremely limited exemptions, which I agree need to be worked through by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which is cross-party. I don't think anybody should be serving and working in second jobs.
But should there also be a time limit, though? I mean, with the best will in the world, nobody would criticise Rosanna Allen-Khan for doing shifts as an A&E doctor to help out during the pandemic. But what happens actually if an MP was a GP and they end up actually doing 3 days working as a GP and not being around for their constituents? So should there be a time limit?
I think that's something that could definitely be explored.
So there should be a time limit.
Well, I think that's something for the Committee on Standards in Public Life. But I do think it should be extremely limited to jobs that are considered only in the public good.
But if you want to ban all second jobs apart from those exceptions, why is that ban not in the motion that you've put forward for MPs to vote on, I think, round about now, actually?
Because that was drafted today to force the issue on cash for access, essentially, which is what Owen Paterson was doing, and to restore the principle that should be at the heart of the standard system that says that we should only be serving in our constituents' interests. Keir Starmer laid out at his press conference yesterday how we wanted to go further, and the other recommendations that we intend to make, which includes banning second jobs.
Right, well, before I come back to you, Paul, I mean, in the last 2 years, your front bench colleague, David Lammy, earned around £40,000 for more than a dozen speaking engagements and £33,000 for hosting a radio show on LBC, all obviously above board for now. Would that be allowed under your proposals?
Well, I'd imagine that things like being paid for a radio station slot probably will be sacrificed in those proposals. That would be considered a second job to most people.
Right. I mean, when will that happen? Because there is some disquiet, isn't there, amongst MPs, particularly on the Tory benches, about the sorts of jobs that they are probably going to have to give up.
Well, because if you go down the line that Louise was talking about, we've got farmers, we've got people that are running family businesses that that they had before they were elected, etc. We've got people. I quite, as a small business minister, I like the fact that some people are still working within business, have got a good sense of business, that realise actually small companies, entrepreneurs are not just units of economic activity. There's actually a human cost of when you're actually responsible for other people's livelihoods. That brings some real good reflection into the work that they do as an MP. Clearly, we need to make sure that we get that balance right, and that's why we need to build this cross-party consensus. But it's important that we have that.
Right,
variety.
but how long is it going to be? Do you think, or should MPs be allowed to continue with their existing consultancy work? I mean, Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has already given up his 2 consultancies. Are you encouraging your colleagues to do the same right now?
Well, I think they'll all take their own view, but let's work it through in a cross-party consensus.
Well, how long is it going to be? Are we talking about a matter of weeks, months, or is this just going to drift off into the long grass?
I don't think it should be in the long grass. As I said right at the beginning, this is something that's clearly at the forefront of the media's mind. I don't mean that as a criticism. Yeah. I just mean that it is starting to pervade the public's mind, and we've got to make sure that trust in politics overall does not get further eroded by allowing this to continue. So that's why we need to tackle it.
Has the Prime Minister gone a lot further than he obviously wanted to on this whole issue? Has he gone further? Does he risk angering Conservative MPs who have got relatively well-paid outside earnings that they are probably going to have to give up?
Well, my experiences of speaking to colleagues over the last couple of days is that they're trying to digest what is likely to come forward. Because, as I say, bearing in mind, this is something that was already discussed in 2018, so it's already on the table.
Except, Minister, a fortnight ago, Boris Johnson had no intention of changing these rules at all. Repeatedly, he said he didn't have to change.
But bear in mind, this is something for the House. It's not a government. It's a government proposal, but it's not a government that decides this. This is the.
Government wanted to repeal those rules 2 weeks ago. You voted to do that.
This is Parliament that will decide this. This is Parliament because it has to be a cross-party consensus, and it's right that Parliament makes those decisions.
Right, but has the about turn just come because you or Boris Johnson couldn't get away with it, as Labour say?
No, what I said is it's at the forefront of what we are discussing, and so we need to tackle it on head on. That's what leadership is. You see a problem, you tackle it, and that's where we need to go. But we do need to get it sorted so that we can restore trust in politics in general.
And the detail is going to be very important, as we've talked about people earning money either as lawyers or from speaking engagements. I mean, yesterday Keir Starmer appeared to suggest that the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Faulkner, would probably be exempt from Labour's second jobs plan because, as he said, the position of the House of Lords is different. Would you be happy to allow Labour members of the Lords who are front benchers, for example, to represent mining interests in the British Virgin Islands?
Well, I mean, there is a distinction, isn't there? And that's why we're talking about MPs, because we are elected and Lords don't earn a salary like we do. I think that's where a lot of the public anger comes from, is we are paid very generously as members of Parliament, and we've heard some colleagues going out there complaining that they can't cover their childcare costs, and that's why they need to work in second jobs. That's profoundly offensive to people that are struggling to get by at the moment, the idea that they wouldn't be able to survive on £80,000 a year. So I do think there is a distinction that needs to be drawn between MPs and Lords. But certainly it would not be acceptable for anybody to be lobbying on behalf of commercial interests in the House of Lords.
All right, let's move on because you are the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary. Laura, ongoing negotiations between the EU and the UK over Northern Ireland. Just show you this headline in the BBC News. Northern Ireland Protocol. Deal can be done, says Lord Frost. Lord Frost, the Brexit Minister. Now, this has been pretty tense and fractious over a long period of time. Still no deal has been done. Do you think that there is any movement on either side?
I think we're certainly approaching a decisive time, either whether that is a decision that both sides, the EU and the UK, think actually we have to put our differences aside and make a deal, or whether it is, as a lot of people suspect, that Downing Street concludes actually this has gone as far as it can in terms of the current process and they have to therefore take it to the next stage, which would be Article 16, which essentially would trigger a dispute process, so a bit like going to a tribunal to try to sort the mess out. Let's just remember for viewers what this is actually about. And everyone will remember during the Brexit deal how it ended up was with separate arrangements for Northern Ireland to try to avoid there being a hard border. That means that Northern Ireland in some ways still has to follow some EU rules. The UK is very unhappy about how far-reaching those rules are, but the EU says, look, that was part of the deal, you can't complain about it now. And what's been happening in the last few months is both sides trying to kind of get towards brokering some kind of arrangement, but they really haven't got very far. And Lord Frost has been in Northern Ireland this week. He'll be in Brussels also on Friday. And there is definitely a sense that we're getting towards the moment where a decision has to be taken.
All right, well, let's hear from Lord Frost himself. He was on the radio this morning. Here he is.
So I think we are focusing on the negotiations. We want to reach an agreement if we can. It's got to be an agreement that does the job and changes the situation, not an agreement for its own sake. If we can't get to that, then obviously Article 16 is a possibility, and a very real possibility. But it will be determined on the basis of whether we've reached an agreement or not, and that's what we're really trying very hard to do.
Right, I mean, Lord Frost there, Paul Scully, saying that it is still a real possibility triggering Article 16, in other words, suspending part of the agreement that was done between the EU and the UK. I mean, that would cause a major diplomatic row. I mean, you need that like a hole in the head.
We don't want to invoke
it's a real possibility.
We don't want to invoke it if we don't need to. That's what he's right to say, that we want an agreement that actually means something, that actually does tackle the real problems that businesses are having moving goods between GB and Northern Ireland in particular, which I've spoken with Lord Frost to businesses and heard from them firsthand. We don't take it lightly. We're not, but it's right that we have that in our pocket to use should talks fail, because we have to have an agreement that works for all sides.
Right, and your solution, Louise, Labour's solution, would be for Northern Ireland to be aligned more closely with the EU.
Well, the problem that the government has with these negotiations with Article 16 is twofold. First is, as Laura's rightly pointed out, Article 16 is merely a kind of arbitration process. It just enters us into more formalised negotiations. So it's not a solution in itself. It doesn't rip up the protocol or provide an alternative or abandon it at all, as some are pretending it does. And secondly, Article 16 can only be triggered if there are consequences that were unforeseen. Now, everything that we are experiencing and Northern Ireland is experiencing at the moment was entirely foreseen, because when you take one part of the United Kingdom out of the European Customs Union and leave another part in, then there's going to be economic disruption.
So you would like the whole of the UK to be more close to
what we have asked for is for the UK to negotiate as a whole, for the whole of the United Kingdom, to negotiate with the European Union a common veterinary agreement. So there are commonly high standards across the whole of the United Kingdom. That would reduce drastically the checks and controls that are currently required between Britain and Northern Ireland. But also, what I've repeatedly asked is for Northern Ireland's elected representatives to be brought directly into the negotiations. At the moment, huge decisions are being made about their future that they have absolutely no say in, and there is a really serious issue about the democratic deficit of what's being imposed on Northern Ireland right now. If the government were truly negotiating in their interest, they'd allow those politicians to be at the table.
But this is one of the other issues to all of this, is that there's a very fragile, tense political situation on the ground in Northern Ireland. Many unionists would actually look at this and say, well, if Article 16 is not triggered, then they face very, very, very tricky circumstances. And it's right.
The question then is, what then? Article 16 is triggered. Where do we go then?
And Article 16, from a political point of view, from Downing Street, they may feel, someone in government said to me, that actually if the EU doesn't change its position quite significantly, they may conclude that they have little choice but to trigger it, because they've said consistently since July that the conditions have been met. I'm not suggesting that's the right thing to do, but that's the view some people in government hold. But the political risk around doing it is it's Pandora's box. This is a new process. Nobody knows exactly how the EU would respond. It's not clear how much of the agreement that the UK would want to suspend, because there's a sort of mini Article 16, and we might say, well, we want to suspend this kind of checks, or there's quite a sort of maximalist approach to suspend a lot of the agreement. So this is your classic, forgive me for using the cliche, it would be completely uncharted territory. And there is a real risk that the EU response might be very, very grave indeed. You know, the Irish politician Simon Coveney has even suggested if the UK goes down this role, well, the EU might end up suspending the whole trade agreement with the UK. Well, and so it's all very, very uncertain, which is why the UK right now wants to at least look as if they're thinking through it very carefully.
I mean, what would that be like if the whole treaty is suspended in the way Simon Coveney?
Well, I don't really want to speculate on that, because what we found...
Well, he said it. He said it. It may have to be. You speculated about triggering Article 16.
We also heard the EU saying there's absolutely nothing can be done when we first put our command paper, and then we saw them move further on down the line. So there when you have any negotiation of this side, there's always this walking around and fighting talk that goes on, and actually what we want to make sure is that there are constructive conversations going on between Lord Frost and his opposite number, and which is happening at the moment. That's what I really want to focus on.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests here with me today, and tomorrow we will be talking about the government's rail review and exactly what it is going to mean for the north of England in terms of connections. From all of us here, bye-bye. Yes, that was a very, very good question. Time. Jake Berry, that was